Welcome to the LeaderImpact podcast. We are a community of leaders with a network in over 350 cities around the world, dedicated to optimizing our personal, professional, and spiritual lives to have impact. This show is where we have a chance to listen and engage with leaders who are living this out. We love talking with leaders, so if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions to make the show even better, please let us know. The best way to stay connected in Canada is through our newsletter at leaderimpact.ca or on social media at LeaderImpact. And if you're listening from outside of Canada, check out our website at leaderimpact.com. I'm your host, Lisa Peters, and our guest today is Paul Jefferson. Paul studied agriculture at the University of Guelph, where he obtained his undergraduate degree in crop science and his master's degree in plant breeding and genetics. He began a 26-year career with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and in that time, he studied range management at Utah State University, where he completed his Ph.D. in 1987. His career also included 9 years as vice president of the Western Beef Development Center. He was the editor of the Canadian Journal of Plant Science from 1998 to 2000. Paul and his wife Nancy have 3 children, 1 daughter-in-law, and 1 grandson. He retired in 2016 and consults on agricultural research and scientific writing and is an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan. He has published 88 scientific, peer-reviewed research papers and has given many technical presentations. Paul believes that no research project is complete until the results are published in a peer-reviewed journal article. His personal discovery that science and faith are not contradictory, but complementary, has impacted his work and life. Paul and Nancy have been billet parents of teenage hockey players on the Humboldt Broncos team each season for the last 10 years. On April 6, 2018, the team bus collided with a semi-truck, resulting in 16 fatalities and 13 injuries. The crash made news around the world and prompted condolences from public figures and celebrities, vigils and tributes such as people leaving hockey sticks outside their doors. Paul has shared with many groups how his faith sustained him during the tragedy. Join us now for a conversation with Paul about building personal resiliency. Thank you for joining us, Paul. It is nice to have you here.
Thanks, Lisa. It's nice to be with you.
Well, we'll jump right in. I would love to know, how did you ever get to be a billet parent with the Humboldt Broncos?
Well, it actually started back in 2005. We were living in Swift Current, and Nancy was working with Swift Current Bronco hockey players as an EA, educational assistant. She was helping them with their studies and at the high school there, and she recognized the need for people who care about them to be involved as billets. Of course, I focused on the fact that just a few years before, the sexual scandal, the sexual abuse of hockey players had really broken out in Swift Current, as it was a location where that had happened. And I knew some of the players had a reputation as being pretty wild guys who liked to party. And so I was against having a billet. And she said to me one day when we were talking about it that, if good people don't take in these players and look after them without being interested in, financial reward or recognition or any of that, if people wouldn't volunteer to do this, who will be left to do it? And it was just another example of how Nancy opens my eyes many times in our married life to my own selfishness. And I thought, yeah, she's right. And so we started there, actually. And then 2 years later, when we moved to Humboldt, of course, team name was the same here at Humboldt Broncos, but we took a year off for the year of the move, and then we started billeting again here.
Wow. So in 2016, you had a few players living with you?
Yes. So in 2016 or 2018?
Oh, 2018. My apology.
Yeah. In 2018, we had Tyler Smith and Parker Tobin come to stay with us. They were the 17th and 18th guys we've had in our house. So Tyler came and we got to know him. He's a very outgoing, very personable guy. And we liked him a lot. And then this fellow was coming for a few days just before Christmas, this goalie named Parker Tobin. So we checked him out with Tyler, said, well, this guy, he knew him and he'd be okay, he said. So Parker came and stayed the weekend. And then he can stay till Christmas. Sure, that's fine. Yeah, he stayed till Christmas. And after Christmas, he had the opportunity to move to another billet. And we kind of talked to him about that. No, he wanted to stay. He wanted to stay with us. And I think because Nancy's a really good cook, and Parker enjoyed that. So he was with us for, about 4.5, almost 5 months. And so the two guys that were involved in the accident were with us from November, December until April.
Okay. And they really do become part of your family, don't they?
Well, it was really interesting because we always offer to include our billets in our family activities. But these two really engaged in that. And because Parker was a little more academic, a little quieter, he and I would get into these academic discussions, and we really connected. And, Tyler and Nancy would be laughing at Parker and I because we'd be debating something from history or the news or something academic, and they weren't interested in that. But Parker and I had these great discussions, and we spent some time together, and they really did become like our own kids, to the point at Easter, our own kids had come home for Easter dinner, and they started to complain, in a joking, teasing way that Parker and Tyler were now the new favorites in the family. So, yeah, they really did become part of our life.
So not quite the crazy boys you thought those hockey players were.
They had their moments, but
Okay.
we enjoyed those crazy times with them as well. And one of the things I did learn becoming a billet parent is, well, you treat them like your own kids in many ways. That's how you integrate them in your family, is treat them like your own. You have to remember that they're young adults, and they're going to make some decisions that you're going to think, well, that really wasn't very wise, but that's part of their growing up, right? It's like your own kids. So, yeah, we became very close with these two young men.
Yeah. So getting into April 6, 2018, what do you remember most from the accident and the days that followed?
Well, the night that we were going up to the game, so we were driving to Nipawin from Humboldt when we got a phone call from a friend that there had been an accident and it was bad. When we got to the crash site, of course, the emergency people were already there and wouldn't let us get close. So they were already moving the victims to the two regional hospitals, local hospitals. So we turned around and went back to Tisdale and went to the hospital there to wait for word about what had happened and so forth. And when we were there, basically many of the families that had been on their way to the game, girlfriends, billet families, had either gone to the hospital in Nipawin if they had already been past the accident site when it happened, or they came back to Tisdale. So between the two locations, the families were gathered in rooms while the hospital staff did their best to kind of let us know what had happened. And that's where we were, basically surrounded by people we're all in shock, and we're all grieving. We're all wondering what has happened, wondering what's going on. And it was a very tough time. I remember sitting and obviously in distress, but praying. And this counselor from the hospital staff said to me, "Well, this must be the worst night of your life." And I remember thinking, well, it's terrible. It's an awful tragedy, and we don't know what's happened. But no, I think I have faith in Christ, so I have hope. And we found out there that Parker had been airlifted from Nipawin to Saskatoon. Nancy was able to see Tyler. He was actually at the Tisdale Hospital, and he was being taken to St. Paul's Hospital in Saskatoon. So there were our two different boys were going to be in two different places, but we packed up from Tisdale, drove back home here to Humboldt, picked up some clothes in case we needed them, and medications and whatever, and we drove into Saskatoon to be with the boys. So we went first to RUH, Royal University Hospital, and we found out that Parker had some pretty significant injuries and was able to get into the ICU and see him, but he had a facial injury, and his face was basically covered by medical equipment because he'd been put in an induced coma. He had a number of spinal injuries, and they were really concerned, so they had put him in a coma. So wasn't able to actually talk to him, and was just sitting there with him in the ICU. So I stayed with him, and then Nancy went over to St. Paul's hospital, to the other hospital, to see Tyler. And in the morning, so we were there through the night, and in the morning, Parker's parents had arrived, and some family. So I kind of stepped back and wasn't sitting with them as much. And of course, it was pretty crazy in the ICU because they had, many of the accident victims were in the ICU. And a lot of family were coming and lots of visitors. And it was a lot of crazy activity that the ICU staff were struggling with. I remember that part. So on Sunday, Parker had surgery and was stabilized. So we were able to get some sleep Saturday night, Sunday morning. And then we were coming back for the vigil on Sunday evening back here in the rink in Humboldt. And we attended that. And then we got the call that Parker had woken up and said, "No, I'm not Parker. I'm Xavier LaBelle."
Wow.
So that was quite a shock. So hopped in the truck, drove back to Royal University Hospital to see for ourselves. And as soon as we walked into the ICU, we could see Xavier sitting in the bed, sitting up, awake, and looking out. And as soon as we caught sight of him, we said, "Well, of course it's Xavier, and it's not Parker." So that was a second go around of, this is really tough. But again, while we couldn't sleep and we were processing our own grief and trying to support Parker's parents and doing what we could there, we realized that, I'm not alone in this. So that was probably as bad as the Friday night was Sunday night.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, of course, over the next several days, you start realizing, well, we got to travel for funerals, and we tried to do as many as we could, but we got to 10 out of the 16 funerals. And so some of the boys in Alberta, we didn't get to their funerals, but we were able to get to Parker's service. And that was very important to us. And yeah, it was very big. You can imagine the hockey rink there was in his hometown was full. And then, of course, all the other funerals that we attended, it was a tough time. But again, our faith sustained us through that.
Yeah. So earlier, when the counselor had asked you, "This has got to be the worst day of your life," and you said, "No, I think." What? Yeah. What if that wasn't? I have to ask you, if that wasn't the worst day of your life, what was? I don't know if you want to share that.
It goes back a lot of years ago. I mean, when I was growing up on the farm, I think I realized, subconsciously at least, that my dad admired successful people, and I wanted my dad's approval. So I gave up things like music and even sports that I wasn't particularly good at, but I enjoyed. And I gave them up to focus on things that I was good at and had a lot of success at. And one of those was school, so I kept going. I went to university, as you said, and did just well enough as an undergraduate to get into graduate school. And about halfway through my master's program, that was about the toughest time of my life. I realized my master's degree was not going to produce anything publishable. And a scientific publication is kind of the measure of your success as a researcher. And so I was very, very down about that. And then I had a long-term relationship with a young lady, break up, and that was devastating to me. And I thought I'm a personal and professional failure. And I really struggled with that. Like everything had to be successful and I was going to fail. And I actually had suicidal thoughts at that time. And I have to admit that it took me a long time to admit that actually was how dark that time was. Anyway, I met this young lady and we started dating, and she was different than other girls that I had dated. And it turned out that one of the things that was very different about Nancy was she had a faith in Christ. And she began to talk about that with me. And I said, no, I don't want anything to do with it. It's too easy. Just put your faith in this person named Jesus. I mean, that's too easy. And so we had many discussions about this. And one night she said, God doesn't want just smart people to be saved. And it hit me. Yeah, I'm making it complicated here. I'm asking God to make it so that intellectually I can grasp it when it's not that hard to grasp. It's not easy, but it's simple.
Yeah.
And so later that night, I was really struggling with this sense of failure. And so I prayed that, God, if you're real, come into my life, make me a success. And in life and in professionally, and just, I need you. And in that instant, I can't explain it, but in that instant, something changed. And I had hope. I had a sense of peace that I had never experienced in my life. I knew that the inner turmoil, all this arguing with myself and with Nancy, it was gone. And I knew in that moment that something had changed. And I remember thinking, well, yeah, I have hope that I had never experienced before. And I've never really lost it. I mean, there's times when you think, oh, this looks hopeless, but then you remember that moment. No, there's hope in Christ. So that was the point where I think that was the worst night of my life. But in that, I found faith.
Right. So going back to your introduction, I find it interesting, you're what I would call the science guy. And I think people listening, your bio is again, science guy. So how did science and faith, because that's quite a conversation. Many people don't believe science and faith go together. Yet you found this, it does.
It was, I don't know, a few months after this decision. I was studying a graduate level cytogenetics class. And it was pretty intense. And we were studying the structure of DNA, the thing that makes you who you are, that chemical compound in your body that transmits genetic information. And we'd just gone over how complex it was, the structure of it, the layers of structure of DNA. And I remember saying to my professor, well, okay, where in nature is the simpler form of this? Because evolution teaches us that the simple things evolve to the more complex. And this is incredibly complex. Where's the simpler version of this in nature? And my professor said to me, well, there isn't one. You and I and viruses, the simplest form of life, all have the same structure of DNA. And that's when it hit me. God had to have done that, because that can't happen by chance. There's just no way. And I know that there are many people who say, well, yes, there's amino acids in the primordial soup of the world back billions of years ago. And I can believe that there were, but I have a hard time believing that you can go from simple amino acids to this incredibly complex DNA structure just by chance. And if there were intermediate steps, there should be a record of it somewhere, and there isn't anywhere that I can find in science. But that was the point where I started to think, well, okay, if God is the great creator, then science becomes a study of his creation. And that was really a step for me in that, instead of arguing with myself, do I believe in science or do I believe in God? I say I believe in both, because science is the discovery of God's creation. So, yeah, all through my career, and I mean, I have to say that God answered that prayer from that night, that tough night many years ago, and I had a great career. I got to do my Ph.D. I got to publish lots of research, do lots of research with lots of interesting colleagues. And I really enjoyed that. So God gave me success. But even more than that, he helped me to realize that while that success was great, getting to know him was the best thing.
So I want to go back to, and thank you for sharing that, the faith in the science. I think that's really important. And to hear it from you, who, you're my science guy, thank you. I want to go back to the hard times you go through, and you just talked about your faith. And I just, how do you believe so strongly that your faith will get you through the hard times? And I don't know if you've been through so many hard times. This was just one of, but I mean, there's many hard times in life.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
There are. And I hope I didn't leave the impression that my life since that time 42 years ago has been perfect, because it hasn't been. There's been many tough times. We had struggles when my son was a toddler. He had some health issues that were very scary. We went through that. I lost both my parents, my mom too early. My dad, he was 85, but still struggles when you lose your parents. And Nancy had battled cancer 10 years ago. And so there were times when, we were facing tough situations in life. But in all of those things, we would say to ourselves, do we really trust God? I remember reading Job, in the book of Job in the Bible, about Job's loss, where he lost everything, not just financial, but personal loss, tremendous grief. And his wife, I think, naturally said, well, just curse God and die, because this is awful. She couldn't imagine going on, right? And Job asked God, why did, and so you can hear him question that, because he wondered, why did God do this? And God's answer was amazing to me. This is why. If you read Job, the first chapter of Job, the storyteller tells the reason why, but Job never knows that. And God never tells him. Instead, God says, just trust me. And it reminded me that if we trust God and believe that, yes, he's in control, he is a good God, and whatever's going on, good or bad, he's still in control, and he's working at all things together for good for those who love the Lord, the Bible says. And so, I claim that, and then I remember that sometimes it's really hard to live that. But every time you go through it, it becomes another episode where you can look back later and say, well, we trusted God in this. Can't we trust God for the Bronco accident?
I sometimes think I wished we knew the plan God had for us. We don't.
No. And I've heard that from many people. Like, why did God allow the Bronco accident to happen? I wish I understood that. And I remind myself that there's another great story in the Old Testament in the Bible. It's in Jeremiah, where God allows the Babylonians to come in and destroy Jerusalem because the people had been so disobedient. And Jeremiah had warned them that this is going to happen. He was the prophet who told them this is going to happen. And they still refused to repent. So it happened. Then God said to them, well, go through Jeremiah. He said, go to Babylon, which we call Iraq, right? Go to Babylon, live there, and in 70 years, I will bring you back. And they didn't like that plan. He told them the plan. He told them what they had to do, and they didn't like it. So some of them rebelled, and they said, no, we're heading to Egypt. And they kidnapped Jeremiah, and they took him off to Egypt. And there the war caught up to them and they died there instead of in Jerusalem. And if they'd obeyed God and followed the plan, even though they didn't like it, if they followed the plan, they would have been so much better off. And I think it's a perfect example of where we are today. God does reveal some of his plan to us. And we say, no, we don't really like that plan, God. I have a better plan. You follow my plan and no, that's not what he's telling us. He's saying, no, this is the plan. I'm not going to reveal it all to you because you're not going to like it. So here, just trust me. And I think that's where a lot of people are. I hear that even today, 4 years after the accident, I can still hear people say, oh, I wish the Bronco accident had never happened. Well, of course, we all wish it had not happened, but we have to accept that it did and that God's still in control. And so, living in denial is not going to help us move forward here.
Yeah. Speaking of denial, I think of grief, and I think there are 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So a lot of stuff going on when processing grief. So my question for you is, how did your faith help you deal with the tragedy? Because there's a lot of it, there's a lot going on.
I hear this many times. People talk about stages of grief, like they're kind of steps one after the other. And one of the things I learned in all of this, maybe it's hard to explain it, but it's not a stage of 1, 2, 3. It's more like there's a ball of yarn and it's all tangled up together. And one day you're feeling depressed and the next day you're feeling angry and the next day you're feeling both. And, like you experience so many of the stages of grief simultaneously. And one of the things I learned was that when it's a sudden tragic event, very sudden and very traumatic, like this one, like the Bronco accident, the emotions of grief that you experience can be very, very intense. And since I am a science guy, I've always kind of downplayed emotion. I've always felt that, logic and reason could be brought to bear on problems, and, even things where it demands an emotional reaction, I would try to reason things out. And what I discovered in this time since the accident is that I needed to experience those emotions, the anger, the frustration, the loss. I needed to feel it. And in fact, one of the best statements I heard from one of the grief counseling that I got was lean into it. Like, feel the emotions because it's important. Another comment that the counseling program said was, grief is love that can't be expressed because the person's not with us anymore. So you're feeling that intensity of that love of loss. And if you deny that you're feeling that, because it hurts too much and you want to get away from it, some people immerse themselves in work. Some people find other releases, sometimes bad ones like addictions, to get out of the emotions that they're struggling with. When you go there, you're you're burying it. You're denying that it's real. Then it pops up. That emotion pops up somewhere where you least expect it. And maybe sometimes years later, you're still struggling with the emotions of grief. And so to lean into it was really good advice for me to understand that the more I felt it, the more I could understand it and the more it could lose its power over me. And it was true. I didn't believe it when I first heard it, but as you lean into your emotions in grief, they actually do subside. And it's kind of like, it's really intense at first, and then you look back a month later and realize, yeah, they're still there. I still tear up. I have an emotional reaction to grief 4 years later, but it's not as intense. And I'm able to think that, yes, it is getting better. I call it processing the grief. And I think people get upset with that because they don't, they don't believe that there is ever really healing. But I think, like a physical wound, even grief, there's a scar, but it doesn't feel like an open wound anymore. And people who struggle with accepting that, they can get stuck. And that was another good thing that I learned, is that sometimes people get stuck. And so they're at the angry stage, 4 years after the Bronco accident. I know some people are still angry that it happened, and they're angry at their loss. And I understand it, but they're stuck there and they're not able to move forward. And I think that's one of the things that, Nancy and I do talk about that. Like, what would Parker say if he was still here? And I would think he would say, you've got to carry on with life. Yeah. There are a lot of other people in my life that I want to connect with. Besides my own family, there's people that are involved in my life that I don't want to lose the opportunity to enjoy life with them because I'm stuck grieving. And so, I'm not forgetting Parker, but I also want to move forward.
Yeah. Does it help you to, because I know you speak a lot about this, does it help you to continually tell the story? Does it bring it alive, the memories, the good things, or?
Yes. And that's one of the things one of the reasons I do things like this is because I want to honor Parker's memory. And talking about him is a good way to do that. It's easier. The first time I did it was really hard. It is easier now to do it, but it's still emotional. Like, I find it very draining to do this. And again, because I'm the science guy, I'm not used to dealing with the emotions, right?
Right.
So it takes more psychological effort, I guess, to talk about my feelings than it does to talk about science or agriculture or some of the other things that I talk about all the time.
If anyone listening, only hears one thing today about building personal resilience, because, you've talked about hope and trust and emotions, but if they hear one thing, what do you want people to walk away with today?
I think it's important that one of the things I've said anyway, it's important to remember that none of these things are done by me. Like, these are all lessons I've learned through these experiences. I believe God's teaching me these things so that I have the resilience to deal with trials and tough times. God's changing me through tough times. And I think that's the lesson, that when we don't want to endure tough times, when we take the easy road and say, I'm not gonna deal with this today. I'm not going to deal with this right away. I'm going to push this off into the future, whatever. Or I'm not going to pay the price now for success down the road. And some of the things that people say, it's not recognizing that the tough times are really the times where you learn the most. And God, for Christians particularly, tough times are when God's teaching you things that you otherwise weren't really all that interested in, right? So, when times are good, we're awfully self-satisfied as Christians. And when times are tough, that's when God's really walking with us and teaching us what we need to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about, at the trial, there was the victim impact statements.
Yes.
And so I went on and I read a few of them, and you gave a victim impact statement, and you actually asked them to be lenient with the driver. And I went through a few of them, and I even wrote some down. The wife of the head coach, she addressed the driver and said, "These are the days when the injustice and sadness and anger are definitely still there. But I have been forgiven for the things that I didn't deserve it, so I will do the same." And Melissa Dirksen, daughter of Glenn Dirksen, who was the bus driver, we're working toward finding understanding and forgiveness because that's what my dad would have wanted. And then you had asked for leniency. I want you to talk about forgiveness. And well, I'll ask you to start. Just how did you get there? How do you move forward, and where does forgiveness?
After the accident, I was really angry at the driver. He was at fault. And his momentary distraction, carelessness, caused tremendous loss. And I was so angry. And as I was going through our grief counseling, they talked about forgiveness. And I thought, yes, as a Christian, I know Jesus calls us to forgive one another. And I thought, how can we forgive such a terrible, terrible tragedy? And yeah, it was a reminder that God calls us to forgive. So I want to be obedient to that. But the second thing that the grief counseling did was it pointed out that when you forgive, you actually are making a statement that you accept that this injury has happened. So there's no more denial, running away from it. You're accepting that this has happened and this permanent injury has occurred. But by offering forgiveness, you're actually receiving healing yourself. And I thought, I want that. So it took me a while. It took me many months after the accident to get to the point where I could say, yes, I forgive the driver. So then if you say, well, I forgive, then how do you express that? How do you communicate that you forgive? And, lots of people, many people that I talked to between the accident and the trial, they wanted them deported. They wanted them thrown in jail for life. They wanted, all kinds of tough sentences. And certainly that was within the bounds of the law to have him serve a long time in jail for what had happened. But I thought, no, if I am forgiving him, I'm going to ask for leniency because he's got a wife. He's new to Canada. He's trying to build a life here. Yeah, the trucking company was at fault. The people that taught him how to drive the truck were at fault. There's a lot of people who can bear some responsibility for this besides him. Yeah, he made a mistake. And that was a struggle for some people. When I said that in my victim impact statement, it's a terrible mistake. But I choose to forgive. And one of the parents said it wasn't a mistake. They couldn't accept that it was something that they could forgive. And it made them very angry that some of us talked about forgiveness. We were doing it. I don't know about Glenn's daughter, but I know Christina and I know her faith. We were doing it from our faith-based perspective, right? That we're offering forgiveness. We're choosing to forgive. But some people who don't have that faith, they struggle with the idea of forgiveness. I know Parker's parents both said to me they wanted to forgive, but they weren't sure they were ready to do that. And I thought that's fine because everybody needs to come to this point in their own way.
Right.
But it is an important point to choose to forgive because the desire for vengeance becomes like a poison to you when you carry that in your heart. And I don't need that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. I found it. So when I started talking to you, a week ago, we prepared for this day. I was doing a 7-day Bible plan, and I chose one on forgiveness. And this morning was, and I got to put on my glasses. It was Colossians 3:13, and it said, "Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others." And it was Colossians 3:13. And I remember when we talked last week, I too am a speaker with Leader Impact Global Forum, and I talk about hope. But I had a woman named Hope that helped me, and it blew me away that God would send me a woman named Hope to help me during an earthquake. But Colossians 3:13, I also talk about the number 3:13. And I won't go into my story. We'll listen to it one day. But all of a sudden that hit me today. 3:13, the number came to me. So I know that I have some forgiveness somewhere. But I just want to thank you for sharing today. Having a moment. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to Leader Impact. A few questions, because I wonder, you telling your story now with Leader Impact. How did you get involved with them and telling your story? Like, where did it start for you?
Oh, many years ago, I was in a small group with Jim Ginter from
Swift Current.
Leader Impact and Swift Current.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim had mentioned this global exchange program that they'd run, and I should go. And okay, I put it off. But when I retired, I thought, well, I have no excuse anymore. So I went on one of their global exchange trips to Cali, Colombia, and had an amazing experience there, sharing my faith. And then right after the accident, I went to Paraguay with Leader Impact. And in Paraguay, God knew what he was doing. All of the opportunities for me to talk about agriculture science and faith and scientific writing, which is kind of the professional talks that I give, they all fell through or weren't there. And so I had lots of time just to pray and think about what I'd gone through. And I started to write this story down about the Bronco accident. And that's where the staff from Leader Impact said to me, you need to share this story. So I've been on, 3 trips now with the Global Exchange and shared my story virtually in the last couple of years because of the travel restrictions. And I think it's 4 or 5 times, I can't remember, number of times now virtually, but I'm hoping to travel again with them. So
good. Yeah, I have been asked to travel as well. I've done a lot of the virtual, and it's really amazing. And you can see people, and they're just their eyes are big, and they're watching you, and they understanding a part of your story, even just a little part, they grab onto. So thank you for doing that. So I see all the books behind you. Just wondering if there's a favorite leadership book back there that you could share with us.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was a big John Maxwell fan for a long time. Read everything that I could get of his, and then I have one of his recent ones, and I have referred to him a lot when I was still working. I was thinking about, I really liked Patrick Lencioni, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Blew me away when I read it because it just described so many instances in my professional career where we weren't able to work together effectively as a team. And so I like those 2 books. There's probably many others out there that I just haven't discovered yet, but those 2.
Yeah. And that's why I ask, so that I can discover more books and people know what's out there. I actually did a social media post, like, what's your favorite? And I got, my list is huge, so I have a lot of reading to do. So before I go, I always ask 2 final questions. But before I go and ask these 2 final questions, I just want to ask, are you currently billeting anyone?
We had a Bronco again this year. I think Tyler was the 22nd or 23rd. I've lost track now. We were asked, like right after the accident, well, will you keep on billeting? And my response, well, of course, because we're not, how do I put this? We're not afraid to build new relationships because of the hurt of losing someone that you were close to in the past, right? So we had a Bronco every year, even since the accident. And Tyler Smith came back the fall after the accident, spent a few weeks with us and realized that he needed to do more than just his physical recovery. So he went home again. And so that was a short period for that season. But then the 2 seasons, even last year in the COVID shortened season, we had a young man from Quebec with us and quite enjoyed him. And it's been great.
That was, the question really, yes, I have, but to say that you're going to love again. We can't not stop. So thank you for taking that so much further than yes, because that is really important. Is we can't shut down.
Right.
You have so much to offer. So my 2 final questions, and I hope this isn't too hard, but Leader Impact is about making, leaders having a lasting impact. So as you continue to move through your own journey, just wondering, have you considered what you want your faith legacy to be when you leave this world?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, 42 years ago, I would have said my professional career and, my legacy, and even 6 years ago, I probably would have said my family and my relationships with my kids. Certainly lots of people consider those things as your legacy, right? Mm-hmm. But as I think about it, I'm not sure that I want anything more than when I'm gone, people say, that guy loved God with everything he had and encouraged other people to do the same. And if I have a legacy, that's it. Because everything else doesn't matter.
Right. Well, you're that guy. You're that guy.
Yeah, I hope so. That's what we're working towards. And I don't want people to think that, hey, he's some super Christian. I'm not. I had moments after the accident where I couldn't think straight for days. So, there was times when Nancy had to make decisions for us as a family and as a couple that I should have been involved in. I just couldn't function. So I'm not a super saint, and I don't think there is any, actually. People who say they are, I just don't believe it. Anyway, I'm not that guy, but I'm the guy who loved God with everything he had.
You're that guy.
Yeah.
So my final question is, what brings you the greatest joy?
Holding my grandson.
Oh.
He's a delight. And I just have so much fun doing that. Teaching him, he loves the farm toys. And while I didn't farm after I left home for university, I love teaching him how to play with the farm toys and playing with them. So that's awesome.
You're just a big kid.
Yeah. Well, lots of researchers are, right? Wouldn't it be fun to try this? And then we go and try it. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Paul. This brings us to the end, but thank you for sharing, your story on building personal resilience. I have enjoyed our time together. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, it's been a great time. So thank you. So this ends our podcast, but if people want to touch base with you or find you, how can they get a hold of you or find you?
I have a professional page on LinkedIn. They can find me there. It's pretty obvious because it's Paul Jefferson and Ag Research, Agriculture, Forage Management, and Scientific Writing, I think, is my byline there. So they can look me up there and send me a message and we can connect.
Okay. You're that science guy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Paul, for joining us. I have truly loved every minute. Thank you. All right. Well, if you're part of Leader Impact, you can always discuss or share this podcast with your group. And if you are not yet in the Leader Impact group, we would love to have you. Check out our groups available in Canada at leaderimpact.ca Or if you're listening from anywhere else in the world, check out LeaderImpact.com or get in touch with us by email, info@leaderimpact.ca, and we will connect you. And if you like this podcast, please leave us a comment, give us a rating or a review. This will help other global leaders find our podcast. Thank you for engaging with us. And remember, impact starts with you.